Thank you very much, Don. I didn't know you were involved in the Pioneer Farmer side. I really didn't know that, but it makes sense. It's a pleasure to be here in Blacksburg. My wife attended Virginia Tech, so that's a good thing. And I was one of those commuting boyfriends from the Northern Virginia area. So it is great to be here, and thank you for coming here tonight. This is my boss, George Washington. On either screen, I don't know which one you all are going to look at, but I have a little mouse that I can, where'd he go? There he is, so I can go right around his head here. He's a great boss. Doesn't really bother me on a day-to-day basis. But he left me a lot of instructions, and those instructions come in the form of 35 volumes of writings, 6 volumes of diaries, his ledgers. And not only that, but we have visitors that came to visit him that were so impressed about being there, they would write in their diaries about what they saw and whether they met George Washington or not. And so it's that information that allows me and other staff at Mount Vernon to try to represent the estate as accurately as possible. But let's give credit where credit is deserved, and that is to this lady here, Anne Pamela Cunningham. Mount Vernon would not be what it is today without her and the ladies that now own the property. And this is their 150th anniversary. Well, actually last year was. Anne Pamela had a plantation in South Carolina called Rosemont. Her mom was going upriver one evening, moonlit evening, and she noticed that the house was somewhat in disrepair. So she thought this would be a wonderful undertaking for her daughter, who was an invalid due to a horse riding accident when she was very young, to gather the women across the country and try to save this wonderful site. She took on that task, and for many of the years, early years when she was writing, trying to get support for her efforts, she signed it a Southern matron. And actually that was later on. The earliest letters she used a man's name because women weren't supposed to be doing this back then. So really this is the first girl power movement, I think, in this country. And she and her, well, this is what the house looked like actually when they purchased the property. So you can see why Mrs. Cunningham could see from the river that this needed attention, and the house of George Washington certainly did not deserve to look like this. So Anne Pamela gathered a group of women, and let me just show you this. This is, you can, oh, where is it? Okay, so you can see the piazza's falling down, and it's supported by ship's masts that are just stuck there to keep it from falling any further. The house could use a coat of paint. The grass certainly could be mowed. It needed some attention, and so Anne Pamela and her group of ladies got together, and this was their first group photograph on the piazza of Mount Vernon, surrounded by the Houdon bust that was done by the French sculptor Houdon. And there's Anne Pamela admiring Houdon, and him, and not Houdon, George Washington admiring Anne Pamela. What the ladies may have lacked in beauty, they made up in determination and fortitude and a lot of foresight, and they've continued to operate in that fashion since their forming. And of course, what they did was repair the house. That was the first thing. First priority was let's get the house back in order. So the house that they received was the house that they fixed up. Piazza's in good shape, the railings back intact, the sun porch, everything's painted, the grass is mowed, everything's looking pretty good. But the ladies realized soon thereafter that actually the railing up on the top and the sun porch were later additions, and so they needed to remove them, which they did. And so now the house is as it was during George Washington's time. And fortunately, the house never went through the, it was always in the Washington family hands and never went through the Victorian age when a lot of historic structures, interior structures were destroyed for the addition of bathrooms and closets. So Mount Vernon is very fortunate for that. So the ladies continued to operate over the years. This is probably either the late 1800s or early 1900s. Once again, they're all standing there on the piazza. And then they loosened up a bit, and they decided to get a picture on the ha-ha wall. That's kind of interesting. And it's about this time, this is around in 1968, that a young kid asked his neighbor why he always had money. And he said, well, I work at Mount Vernon. And I said, well, what do you do there? And he says, well, I mow grass, chase sheep, and pick up trash. And I said, wow, that sounds like a great job. How can I get that job? And so I went and had the 5-minute interview and was hired immediately. And almost the second week there, they put me in this costume, and I was there for the 4th of July pageant. I'm the one on the left, okay? Thank you. And so this costume was as itchy as you can imagine. Every burlap, it was horrible. But it was the last pageant they ever had, so at least I was able to participate in that. And I had a ball. And when they put me on this big green Harvest International McCormick tractor, like you would see Eddie Albert driving in Green Acres, seat in the back, smokestack, just the smoke and dirt was coming right in your face, just what a boy likes. That was it. I knew that I was going to be at Mount Vernon for a long time. And the horticulturist actually took a liking to me and said, you know, you're of the age that when I retire, you might want to take my position. And I said, okay, that sounds good to me. And I did like it. And I went to Clemson, got a degree in horticulture. Interestingly enough, the more education I got, the less he wanted me around. And so by the time I graduated, there wasn't even a job for me on the grounds crew. But the maintenance guys, they liked me a lot, and they said, why don't you come paint? And just until you find something in horticulture, go ahead and work with us. I thought that'd be great. So I'm painting. The longtime resident director that had been there for 45 years, he finally left, which was probably a good thing. And a new man came in, and he loved Boxwood, just loved it. And so thank goodness there weren't shredders back then, because somehow he found out I had a degree in horticulture. He came to me and he said, our Boxwood needs help. Would you like to start a Boxwood maintenance program? And I happened to be painting the greenhouse that day, so it was kind of horticultural. And I said, yes, that's what I've always wanted to do. And he left, and I looked at my buddy and I said, what's a Boxwood? So you got to remember, I went to Clemson. So I was Boxwood gardener. That was my first horticultural position. And there's a lot of folklore about Boxwood, a lot of the old books, and there are lots of old books on Boxwood. And you know, Boxwood was running through the woods, and it had these gorgeous flowers, and it did something wrong, and a wood nymph came along and said, to punish you, I'm removing your flowers. And then another wood nymph came along and said, because you've lost your flowers, I'm going to make you the most beautiful plant just with your foliage. So that's that. Interestingly enough, a young girl from Virginia Tech wanted to have a semester where she could work at a historic site in horticulture, and our HR department at the time decided to be matchmakers. And so they said, well, we've got a real cute Boxwood gardener, maybe you want to work with him. So anyway, we can add another folklore story to Boxwood, because if you crawl through Boxwood with someone really cute, things happen. And this is what happened. 4 daughters later, lost my hair. I was cute at one point, but do not let this angelic pose fool you. Penelope's now at James Madison University. Tallulah is at a community college, getting ready to go to culinary school, hopefully. Zipporah's in 7th grade, and she's a sophomore in high school now, and Isabel's in 7th grade. But, you know, we did read about hamsters eating their young and thought, oh, that's so horrible, but we know now why they do that. Okay, back on track. Sorry, I digressed. But George Washington was a very special man, and he fought a war and won, and he was very well known, and he knew that he had become this man that would be recognized, that would be visited, and so he knew that he had to have an estate that was going to be fitting for the man that he had become. His earliest landscape was this. It was very simplistic. The buildings on the side went out at a 45-degree angle. The gardens came out into what is now the Bowling Green. You can see underneath the actual layout of it now, the Serpentine Avenues. And the road came straight up to the house. And this was all based on formal design, which is exactly what your early colonial landscapes were based on. And the reason for that was that they were following landscapes from Italy, France, and England, which they had adopted from one another, and they were all straight lines, parterres, terraces, and so here's an Italian garden famous for their terracing, simple parterres and water features. The French took that idea and really dolled up the parterres, made them incredibly ornate. And then the English, they took that pattern as well, and it was a variation on a theme of geometry. Your early landscape design books that we may have bought 200 years ago, the first chapter during this style of landscape was geometry. Because if you couldn't draw a proper circle, square, rectangle, trapezoid, you couldn't landscape. So this is what it was all about. And this is what happened. All water that was in a landscape was trapped in some sort of canal or pond or something like that. All trees were planted in a row and trimmed. All hedges were trimmed into some sort of shape. And so what they were starting a new movement in England called the naturalistic movement. And they joked about their own landscape, saying all of our trees are touched by the scissor, meaning everything was topiaried. Nothing was spared. And so this gentleman, his name was Batty Langley, wrote this book called New Principles of Gardening. And this was a how-to book. And Langley was a leader, along with Stephen Schweitzer and Alexander Pope, and these are all English garden designers. These were all leaders in this new movement of the naturalistic style of design. So Langley's going to teach us how to lay out and plant in a more grand and rural manner than has ever been done before, parterres, here it is, parterres, groves, wildernesses, labyrinths, avenues, and parks. Everything that you'll find mentioned on this title page, Washington included in his landscape. This book was purchased in 1728, published in 1728. Washington purchased his copy in 1759, but it wasn't until after he returned home from the Revolutionary War that he decided to re-landscape Mount Vernon. And so we know a lot of what he was doing by his diary accounts. He was very good about keeping a diary. This is a picture of his diary. Very pretty little book, very well illustrated. And this is his notes in his diary on particular days. And between 1785 and 1787, you cannot open the reprints of those diaries, which they let me use. They don't let me anywhere close to those. You can't open those pages without a reference to a plant of some sort, or what he may be laying out that day. And so let's take a look at what he was dealing with at that time. The view across the river he didn't have to do a lot about. That was there. That was probably why the original land was patented in 1674. It was close to a river that was, I'm going to say this word wrong, navigable, is that right? Boy, it didn't sound right, but I guess it is. And so he could look from his house across this and say, look at my view, but he was borrowing the landscape. He didn't own that, but it was there. So certainly he wanted to enhance that by not allowing large trees to grow up in the front. And the Potomac River, look at this little jut of land right there. It's still there. I mean, it just hasn't changed from that time. The George Washington Memorial Parkway now comes up the edge here, and Fort Washington is here. But through the efforts of the ladies, pretty much what you see is what Washington saw 200 years ago. And he himself said that no estate in United America is more pleasantly situated than this. And people that visited him would usually always make 4 comments. 1, did they see the general? That was a big deal. A lot of times they didn't. 2, what they had for dinner. That was a big deal. 3 was what they saw in the gardens, and they always commented about this view. They just said it was magnificent. And one gentleman says that what makes it even more magnificent is the constant stream of schooners going up and down the river. So can you imagine that? I mean, when we get a sailboat going by, we're there, oh, look, a sailboat, you know, and you're talking 2, 3 masted ships going up and down this river. It would have been magnificent. In the PS, he said, but the jet skis are bothersome. So, oh, doggone, I'll learn this. So, when Samuel Vaughan visited Mount Vernon, he's from Philadelphia, in 1786, he commented about this view. He said that the trees and shrubs are kept so low to provide an agreeable border beyond, but not to interrupt the view. And he also said that it's a hanging wood. Vaughan was an Englishman, and everything Washington did in his landscape was based on English design, all from English books. So as an Englishman, he knew by definition that a hanging wood is trees on a slope. So he saw the trees, he saw a slope, so it's a hanging wood. Washington never talked about a hanging wood, never tried to create a hanging wood, but what he did was to create a deer park. And that was an incredibly important feature in an English country estate. Why, I don't know. I mean, there had to be thousands of deer bounding around anyway, but he wanted to capture tame deer down in this area for people to be delighted in seeing them graze, maybe even feed them. I don't know. But he fenced it in. 16 acres was fenced, and he bought 6 tame English deer and stocked it with that, and then bought more later. The fence fell down relatively quickly, but it was a serious attempt on his part. And if you look at the 1792 image painting, which is, again, very accurate, the slope's a little steeper than what it is, but Washington planted locust trees to the north of the house, and they're indeed locust trees that they're trying to show there. We have the house for families here that was actually destroyed after Washington completed a greenhouse and slave quarters here. So they painted this just before he took that down. But here's your deer park fence right there. So it was a bit down the slope so that you wouldn't see it from the house, but when you got to the edge, you could see over it and see the deer beyond. So these paintings, we only have a few, but they're incredibly helpful to us. And here are the deer. And this is from, what, 1931, 32. They still had some deer coming up, and it looks like they have some feed boxes there. There we go, right there and there. Now, I can't tell you whether they just are the deer from the neighborhood or what, but they're there, and I'm sure everybody was thrilled. Okay, so let's go back and look at the landscape one more time as it was. This is what Washington was dealing with when he returned home from the war. So January 1785, January 9th, he's riding around his 4 farms looking for trees to landscape his new Mount Vernon. He's finding elms and ash and poplars, dogwoods, redbuds, and a tree that he thinks is a fringe tree. And so the woods was his nursery. And he would tag them, they'd dig them, and they would bring them back. So what happened was, the first thing was he removed the road coming up the center and leveled it to create a bowling green. Every fine English manor had a bowling green. Not necessarily this large. This is a nice size one, but a bowling green was imperative. He bounced the walls back so that you had a bigger area to work with, and he put curved serpentine avenues. And remember what Langley was saying and what the theme of this naturalistic movement was: the curved line is nature's gift. And so you abandoned the straight lines and adopted the curved line. So that was and it's much more enjoyable to walk on a curved walk than it is on a straight, where you see your destination the entire time. On either side, you planted trees. Batty Langley said, if you have to walk more than 20 paces in full sun, your walk is not worth it. So, and Langley was an Englishman, and they're really wussy there. If it's 70 degrees, full sun, they demand shade. So, but there's another thing. Their clothing back then was very hot. They wore undergarment, shirt, vest, and coat most of the time. So they were looking for shade, there's no doubt about it. I think T-shirts would have been a great idea. We beat them at Yorktown, something like that. But they hadn't quite thought of that yet. This is what you're dealing with now. Right here is the bowling green, just out beyond this way. Here's your Serpentine Avenue. And then you have 2 panels which allow you to plant shrubs, and that was called the shrubbery. And so you would mass shrubs there, tall to the rear, low to the front. And then as it gets out toward the end, and this is what Langley taught Washington, the closer to the house you can allow some formality, but the further you get away, go back to nature as much as you can. And so that's what he did. Not a great picture, but this became, why can't I find this arrow? Oh, there it is. It's like Tinkerbell. You don't know really where it is. That was the wilderness area. And that was planted thickly with pines, but there were intricate paths that went all around it. So it was really a neat feature. And this was the thing that people did before and after dinner, was to stroll the gardens and grounds. And this would have been a highlight of someone's visit. And everything occurred in the garden. Talking of personal matters, politics, romance. It all occurred out in these natural spaces. And so Washington was trying to create a space that people would really enjoy. He used hollies as not only a living fence, but also as a way to create rooms. And this was an attempt many years ago to create one of his holly hedges, but it's not terribly accurate, because obviously you can see what they've done here is they've planted small plants together to form this wall. He actually sowed holly seed in drills, and he sowed them 18 inches apart. So he sowed one drill, then another, then another. So you can imagine, first of all, not all of the seed would have come up, but it would have ended up a massive green, and that's what he wanted to create. So this was the outside wall of the wilderness area. And then this is the classic of all classic naturalistic features. It's the ha-ha wall. And a ha-ha wall is a brick wall recessed into the ground. And the idea was to keep the domestic sheep over here grazing if they wanted, but not up there. Everyone thinks there must have been sheep or goats or something like that to help them mow the grass, and that's just not true. They didn't want them there. They grazed too short. They fertilized very unevenly. So you want them down below. But the great thing about a ha-ha wall is when you're looking from the house towards it, it blends into the landscape and you don't see it. Ha-ha, it fools you. It's just an English term. And here you go. Get your good view of the ha-ha, Bowling Green, and now the trees. Now, what did this look like in Washington's day? Nothing like this. Remember, the walls, and this would have been classic geometric design, which is, as you're approaching the house, you saw it all. There was nothing left to surprise or to delight. You knew that there were fine gardens, you saw the walls. You saw the house the whole way. So the walls came out to, there we go, here and there, and the road came straight up. He bounced it back. So when he bounced his walls back, there was nothing here. There were no mature trees already standing. It was all started anew. And he planted hundreds of trees all around this area, all around the Serpentine. Between every forest tree he planted on the Serpentine avenues, he planted a weeping willow between it. So you're talking hundreds of trees. And as someone researching it, trying to represent it, I think, how in the world do you fit all these trees? In one small space, he put 26 southern magnolias. I mean, that's absurd. You know, the guy's obviously not thinking of mature growth here. And then, let's say he wrote 2 million words. I don't know what he wrote, but there's a passage of about 9 words that you finally get an indication of how big these things were. He says, some are 6 inches and some are 2 feet. So that's what he's planting, these little tiny things. And from the forest, he's bringing trees that are probably no more than 8 to 10 feet tall, because getting anything larger than that would be difficult to transplant successfully. We have about 4 trees on the Bowling Green that do date back to 1785. We asked the dendrochronologists that came in and cored those trees. They were from England. Some of the trees that we thought were original ended up not being original. And one I would have bet anything on that was. They cored it, they pulled out the core. I looked at it and I thought, oh dear, some of those rings are pretty far apart. And they counted it and they said they got it to 1819. And I immediately said, core it again. And so after coring it as many times as we did, the tree's dying, but you see, they are English, and I thought they were still mad about the war, and they would lose some rings in their count. But no, it was 1819. We couldn't get any older than that. So we asked them to take the 2 that were original on the Bowling Green, look at the cores, and estimate when they were planted, which was 1785, go to 1799 with the rings that they saw and estimate the height of those trees. The hemlock, which survives from that time, was about 6 feet tall, and the tulip poplar was about 12 feet tall. So it just confirmed that this was the size trees Washington was planting. And here's the only plan that we have of the estate. This was done by Samuel Vaughan. You've already heard that name. He's the one that commented. That comment about the hanging wood is right there. He talks about the hanging wood and the trees beyond. So here's your Bowling Green, your Serpentine Avenues, shrubberies here and here, wilderness areas down here, kitchen garden, flower garden, botanic garden, house for families, not yet destroyed, but as soon as the greenhouse, which is not yet completed, that was removed. Blacksmith shop, which has just been recreated last year. Dung repository down here. That's an important building. That was recreated a few years ago. So it's just, and you can see the groves on either side of the house. Washington, in a letter of acknowledgement with the receipt of this plan, said you've copied or you've drawn my estate exactly as it is, except you've enclosed the view with trees. So the only problem with this plan is right here. There should be a willow mound here and a willow mound there, which would have acted as punctuation points. No plantings would go beyond that. But for whatever reason, when Vaughan went back to Philadelphia, he decided to plant a lot of trees there. But that view would have remained open, so when looking from the house to the west, you would have had a wide open view to the vista beyond. And here's our only other painting from around 1792. And it clearly shows the Bowling Green, the circle area in front. All 18th century homes had circles in front of them, or what you might call a roundabout, because coaches didn't back up very well. And here's a coach coming from the south, which is exactly where it would be coming from. There are your locust trees again, very clearly depicted locust trees. The coloration is exactly right, the Spanish brown on the roof, green on the colonnades. It shows the walk going back to the necessary with vines growing on the house, which is true. The serpentine avenues, this tree is probably a little large. There's George and Martha right there. And another thing that's just amazing is most people that painted or the house, whatever, decided what Washington couldn't do with the hammer and nail, they would fix for him with paint and canvas. And the cupola is, do you see it? There it is. You see how off-center it is? But that's correct. So this artist actually showed it as it was. And let's see. And here we go, an aerial picture today. It shows you that indeed the estate is still very much intact. You can see down here the opening that's supposed to be willow mounds here and here, opening to the west. So let's get a little more into the gardens. This is the kitchen garden. This is exactly probably, what we're going to do now is kind of go on a stroll, as they would have in the 18th century. So we're going around the Serpentine Avenues, and we've come to the kitchen garden, and the gate probably would have been closed. No reason for you to go in there. Everyone had them, and you didn't have to see it to know if it was a good one, because when you sat down to the evening meal, you knew. And there was nothing more special than fresh produce. So this garden was very, very important, and it was Martha's domain. And now there's an important thing to let you know. But it's not yet. See, the reason these talks are so exciting is they're as new to me as they are to you. So this is the kitchen garden in prior to 1930. Very flat. Well, you have the terracing, which is correct to the 18th century, but there are no beds or anything. They're just these terraces, one up top, one down below, with your crops planted all along in rows going north-south. And that's probably very, very accurate. And this is how they used to cultivate. They'd take a mule in there and go ahead and cultivate with that little cultivator. You can actually sit on it, as you can see. And then this is actually the first garden that the Ladies Association, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, decided to use a landscape architect to research and restore. And this is the plan that came out of that, and this is from 1937. So it's quite different than what you saw in those pictures earlier. Very fancy, very ornate, based on geometric designs and patterns. You could take this page right here, right out of one of those early English design books, if you wanted to create a formal English kitchen garden. But we don't know if Washington created this garden or not. This came about during a time what was called the colonial revival of gardens. And during that time, research was done. There's no doubt about it. Archaeology was done with bulldozers, but it was done. And although historical accuracy was important, beauty was more important. It was so important for everything to look just so that people would come again and again and again. Money was critical. They had to have visitors. And so this is the plan that came out of that. And this is an early picture of its recreation. Again, we're talking 1937 that this took place. And this is it today. It's a beautiful garden. And it certainly shows you that a well-cultivated, well-tended kitchen garden can certainly rival a flower garden of any type. It has the cisterns. There are a lot of neat features in here that would be appropriate to the 18th century. The espaliered hedges along to protect the vegetables, the figs along the wall, espaliered trees along the south wall. Just another view, the curved walls. This is how he finished off these gardens. He expanded them to the west, but not with straight lines, but with curved walls. Again, following the theme of the naturalistic movement. He talks about the men moving this house and saying how proud he was they did it with so little damage with the height that they had to raise it. So he's definitely talking about this house. And just another shot looking down. Kitchen gardens and paddocks classically side by side, because the paddock is where your fertilizer is, and there's the dung repository right across the road. So you take the straw and the manure out, put it over here, allow it to go through its first decomposition, and then it was readily available to the kitchen garden for fertilizer or to be put into cold frames down here to create hotbeds. So it all worked very, very well. Now this is the botanical garden. So we're moving on. That was the first restoration that was done, 1937. Turned out to be beautiful, and it's still represented with what you saw. The botanical garden was researched by that real cute young girl that I met from Virginia Tech for part of her research project. Washington wrote a great deal about this, and he fondly called this his little garden. And if you were there and Washington was out from the house but on the property, he was probably digging in here, actually on his knees, digging in the dirt, planting acorn seeds or taking cuttings or something. So he really enjoyed this little space. He tried things here to experiment with them, and if they survived, he called them Virginia proof. Because Virginia is a tough climate. You get the cold, you get the hot, it's a tough climate. So this was his area to try things out. Now we get to the flower garden. There's no real clear evidence that a lot of research was done on this. This garden just kind of developed over time. Now, the flower garden was called the Upper Garden by George Washington. So there obviously was research, but this is the plan that came about. And we think it was around 1940 that it happened. Even reading the Ladies Association's minutes, which I have done extensively, they talk about drawing this plan up, but they don't say a lot about how they got to this point. But this is how you've seen it, or how people have seen it for many years. Now, again, Suzanne, my wife, and I, in 1985, not only were we married, but we were given the responsibility to research this garden, to see if we could represent it maybe a little more accurately than what was drawn on that plan. Here was the greenhouse. We knew that was okay, and we knew that the courtyard in front was okay. No reason to change that. And the parterres are mentioned by Benjamin Latrobe when he visited Mount Vernon in 1796. And he wrote that, once again, since I left Germany, I saw here a parterre, clipped and trimmed with infinite care into the rich form of a fleur-de-lis. So they were here. Interestingly enough, Washington put these parterres, which is the height of formality. So thank goodness Benjamin Latrobe, who was the architect of our nation's capital, mentioned it in his diary, because they may not be there, because they don't make a lot of sense that they would be in this garden. But if you go back to Batty Langley, Langley allowed it. So he said, if you're going to do it, keep it close to the house, but leave it alone when you get further away. So we didn't really touch that. The crescent beds, they were there. We had no reference to them. Washington never mentioned them, but every photograph we'd ever seen, and there was no evidence against it, so we left that. But what really was wrong about this garden, and this is interesting, this is the temporary greenhouse that the ladies built, because the original was destroyed by fire in 1835. And so the ladies recognized that horticulture, the cutting of flowers and fruits, could be a lucrative source of income. So they built this temporary greenhouse until they could find out what the original looked like. So there are your parterres on either side, your courtyard, the temporary greenhouse. But this was definitely wrong, these rose gardens. We found that there was a pretty major rose donation in the 1880s, and these rose gardens were created. And that can happen when you get donations from someone pretty important that may have a lot of money. You got to do something pretty special with it. So these gardens ended up being here. And what was wrong about them, what we knew was, number one, the design was very Victorian, and number two, in the 18th century, they didn't do mass plantings. You didn't plant all of one thing in a particular area, especially in this sort of design. It was pretty, no question, it was pretty, but it was wrong. So we removed them. And this was probably the biggest change we made in 1985. So we took them out, and what we did find was visitors' accounts. When they walked into this garden, they said that they saw squared beds well edged in box. And so that's what we returned. Square beds, we edged them in English box, and then planted the sorts of annuals, perennials, fruit trees, and other things that we know were in this garden, not either by Washington gardeners' references or the visitors' accounts. And then we also knew that there were vegetables in this garden. That was kind of surprising, but it was clear that Washington, Martha and George, who recorded over 700 guests in 1798, needed a lot of produce to feed these people. And so he was not about to create a whole other garden when he had a perfectly good cultivated space here that he could grow more vegetables. And so that's what he did. My wife and I decided, well, where would they have been? So what we did, we put them at a side of the garden that hardly anybody ever sees. They walk into the garden, and they always go toward the workhouse at the other end. They go to the point that's made by the walls. And so that's where we placed them. Seemed to make sense. Okay, parterres. They didn't always look like this. Now if this is kind of a novel, we're at the sad part of the story, because this is what they used to look like. And this is when a young kid from Clemson was hired. And they looked horrible. So I decided, among these ever orange boxwood, to plant these real bright green boxwood, and that made it look even worse. And even when they all turned green, they still looked really bad. So I got real brave and decided to replace them. But I didn't dare remove it all. I dug little trenches around what was there. I know it looks like Aunt Jemima, but it's not. And I filled that with, like any horticulturist would, with everything that was on the market that said it would be really good for plants. So I put it in there because I wanted these things to grow and do well. And then I planted it. And you know, I knew when the ladies came back to town, they were, oh, I don't know, maybe a new title, more money certainly, maybe a knighthood. And I think that they would have done that if they hadn't all died. Yes, I killed 3,000 boxwood in a matter of 2-3 months. I'm one of the few horticulturists in this industry that has malpractice insurance. So anyway, what you can learn from this is when you dig a hole to plant something, what comes out of the hole goes back in the hole. Don't mess it up, because the soil texture and structure, if it's destroyed too much, water will not move from one to the other. So you create a bathtub. And basically I drown these plants in no time at all. So we got serious. We decided we're going to do this right. So we really messed things up. We dug down 3 feet. While we're doing this, we found a cistern that we didn't know about. Almost lost the tractor and driver. But it worked out fine, because now we could drain to this area, which worked out well. We put in positive drainage at the bottom, filter cloth, gravel, sand, and then we brought in our really high, rich, good organic soil, bought wonderfully beautiful boxwood, and they started dying. So the reason for this wasn't my fault this time. We bought boxwood that had Phytophthora in it, and we didn't know it. And so when I walked in the garden, I noticed things weren't looking quite right, and I checked the soil, and it really looked like that we had created such positive drainage that the plants were not getting enough water. So we added more. Phytophthora moves in water, so it was really gas on the fire. It was gone in no time. So that little project up to this point is $32,000. So we planted another 5,000 boxwood. That's another, I don't know, $10,000. They died. And so, but I kept altering things. I wasn't just doing it. And I contacted professors from Virginia Tech, University of Missouri, University of Maryland, and they all came and we talked. And Lynn Batdorf, who's writes books on boxwood, and we're just sitting there, and I'm just on my knees, and I'm not praying really, but I'm just, what am I going to do? And he said, well, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the show? You know, that old comment. And so finally I told the ladies, I said, look, we shouldn't be planting boxwood as an annual. My suggestion is, not smart, very expensive. My suggestion is we're going to give it one more shot. And if it doesn't make it, we're going to change cultivars. Now, the reason we kept trying English boxes was that's what Washington planted. It died again. We changed cultivars to Justin Brower and Morris Dwarf. This is the Justin Brower here, and there's the Morris Dwarf. And this is 10 years now. We haven't lost a single plant. And we did nothing to eradicate the disease. And we talked to the professors about that. Do we sterilize the soil? And they said, no, because you won't get it all. And if there's just one little thing left, it will invade and go through it so rapidly, because you've taken away not only the bad, but the good as well. So there you go. And I think it's worth another look. Quite different from that Aunt Jemima thing, huh? So it is beautiful, and it's worked out well. Okay, these are the larger boxwood. And this is what I used to crawl through when I first started as boxwood gardener. It was an exciting profession, because as I crawled through and people were walking down the path, they would think I was an animal. And they would throw rocks at me and try to scare me away. So I learned that when a group was coming, to be quiet, to just sit, wait for them to go by, and then I would start working again. Because, you know, the bush would move, I'd be breaking branches. And that's just where the dad would go, well, let's look inside a boxwood. Open it up. You know, and everybody's all freaked out. So, and this is what happened to them. Boxwood decline. It was discovered and researched for many years here at Virginia Tech. It is a true pathogen, Pachydomyces buxi, and it just starts to die at one branch, then another, and there's just hardly anything left. This is what that hedgerow looks like now. This is that one picture that you saw, that beautiful box. This is all that's left. So we're looking to plant another type of boxwood, which is called Jensen, and that's right here. I mean, it would be very difficult for anybody to really know that this is not English box, and it seems to be doing fine. If you leave it in pots, it's very susceptible to Phytophthora, but when you get it in the soil, it seems to be okay. This has been planted here for 7 years now, again, in a very disease-rich environment, and it seems to be doing very well. So we are preparing 12,000 cuttings to start working and replanting in this garden, but there's more to this story. Because the boxwood, oh, and you know why I had to, when I was redoing those parterres, digging all that soil out, the reason for that was, at that time, I wanted to pull out all these dying boxwood and plant new. And they said, Dean, you got to kind of prove yourself to us. So why don't you do these parterres first? So I didn't really prove much of anything, did I? But I did prove that we had to change cultivars. So that was a good thing. Archaeologists moved into town, and these are nasty beasts. I don't know if anybody has ever worked with this group of people, but they dig with the smallest implements possible, and it takes forever, and they just are messy. Look at that. It's but I realized not too long ago they're not real smart. If you walk around the estate, everywhere I put my foot is archaeologically sensitive. So if I put a stake in the ground where I need to plant a tree, they got to check it out. So they'll start digging, and all you got to do is, I think I see something else. They keep digging, and by the time they're done, the hole's dug, and I just plant the tree. So it works out. Okay, now this is the upper garden. Now, we had that plan that was drawn in 1940. We don't know about the research. We don't know how that came about. You know that Suzanne and I, after we did our research, we changed the rose gardens because we knew that that was not appropriate. Because all the big boxwood were dying, they decided, and that we were going to replant. They said, look, let's just not replant where the boxwood are now. Let's see, archaeologically, because the science of archaeology has changed greatly. I mean, they can really see so much more now. The science is amazing. Let's dig it up and see what we can find. So all these little squares are where they dug. And here we go again. So all around the garden, even with all that, it's only 10% of the garden. But what we're looking for are original paths, cultivated beds. What could we find? So this is a reminder. This is a refresher course for you. That's what it is. So this is what we did. Remember, we changed from the rose gardens to squared and rectangular beds. Okay, very good. And we didn't know about the crescent beds, did we? They made sense because they were following the curved wall. We had no evidence to dispute them, so we left them. Okay, this is what the archaeologists found. All these intricate squared beds. But they were very deep. They were about 2.5 feet deep. And I'm freaking out because I'm there. What in the world is this? This is not a flower garden. This started in 1763. This enclosure that we're now looking at started as a fruit and nut garden. In 1785, when he was changing it to a naturalistic landscape, it changed to a pleasure garden. And a pleasure garden was an area that you grew flowers, not for their use, but for their beauty and for enjoyment. And here are all these intricate designs. And all of a sudden, it hit me. I said, you found the old garden. You found the 1760s garden, not the 1780 to 99 garden. Oh, yeah, Dean, yeah. I said, well, there's a way to prove it. The way to prove it was to dig outside the wall. Because remember, the 1760s garden came out here. And so if you dig out here and you find the same arrangement, it proves that it's a 1760s garden. And they did. So the archaeologists actually said I was brilliant, and that was so cool. Because not many people say that. So here they are, and here we are in the crescent beds. And they found these strange little ditches, all well defined. And all they're finding is the very bottom 2 inches of organic matter. So that's all that remains. And so what these gardeners were doing, and they were known to prepare their beds very, very well. They would double dig. You've probably heard that before. It's a big English thing, double dig, double dig. And they would go down, but what's amazing to me are these little, at the bottom there are always these little ridges that weren't touched. So that's a bed there, 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 there. What are they doing? What are they preparing for? And are those ridges, do they actually disappear another 6 inches up? So that when you get to the top, it's all just worked. It's just when they're at the bottom, this is what happens. I don't know. But what they did find for sure was that the crescent beds did not exist in Washington's day. There are no paths there at all. It was just a big cultivated space. And so here we are again, the beds, that you can see how this has been dug out. This still has the organic matter in it. And you see the little ridge here that is just the basic clay. Just amazing. And of course, I was distressed. What do you mean? Because I couldn't figure it out. And so she's trying to answer my question. But let's go back. So this is what we know. Here's the Samuel Vaughan plan again. All Samuel Vaughan shows us are these paths, nothing else, no more distinction. But what the archaeologists found is that these paths indeed are the 18th century paths. They've come across them all, very clear. They're very wide, 10 to 12 feet wide, which makes sense. And you hear that a lot because the final question you ask before you implement, after all the research you've done, is does it make sense? If it doesn't, it probably wasn't that way. But if it does, it probably was. So here we go. We got these things. And actually, this path, that courtyard that we figured probably existed, the archaeologists find this path going straight up just like this. No courtyard at all. And this path here stops right here and right there, right where the parterres are now. So there was something there, but it was probably grass. Whenever they don't find gravel or any hard surface, the path must have been grass because they can't distinguish that. So this is what we're dealing with, and let's see what's next. I'm so excited. Okay, so we've been researching this, and the archaeologists have been digging for 3 years, and we were beginning to realize that the garden was wrong as we were showing it, and we started to look at other plans from the 18th century, and they all seem to have this recurring theme of large beds surrounded by borders. And the borders are highly recommended by not only Batty Langley, but Philip Miller, Abercrombie and Maw, and these are all English designers and horticulturists. So the garden's speciality, beauty, was the borders. And so you have these big areas now you see in the Samuel Vaughan plan. So these people in Indiana, this is all going to make sense, are building a scale model of the estate. And so here's the model right there, and there's the real thing. So it's absolutely amazing. And this isn't even done yet, so it's just unbelievable. When I was taking these pictures, I felt like I was in a 60-foot lift, as I normally am taking pictures like that there. It's just incredible. And here is looking down the South Lane, and this is a picture of the South Lane. And so this is all for a traveling exhibit that's going to be gone for 3.5 years, going to different venues. So it forced our hand to come up with the design of what we thought the upper garden looked like, because we wanted to make this model look as it did in Washington's day, not as people see it today. So there were some neat things that happened. Washington talks about planting 13 alternating plants of yellow and weeping willows along this lane. We were able to show that. Easy to show it on a model. It's not so easy to do it on the earth. But there's lots of neat things that we were able to include. So here we go. This is the garden as you would see it, as you see it today. The rose gardens are gone. You have vegetables here. Rose garden's gone. You have squared and rectangular beds there. What we realized were the squared beds that these people must have been talking about were big. They were like this, kind of like the Vaughan plan, and there it is. So we've recreated it now on this model, and we will be recreating it for real, and it will be redone by spring of 2011. So as you walked into the garden by this very wide path, you had a 10-foot border surrounding the garden with beautiful flowers, shrubs, some fruit trees, vines throughout the garden here and here, but all the space in the middle was cultivated for vegetables. And so it just all of a sudden made way too much sense. Where we thought that they may have been hidden in this side of the garden here, there was really not necessary to put them in one side of the garden. You could have them in the center of the borders because the people's eye was not going into the middle. They were just admiring the flowers and other things. So this is what this garden will look like. You all are some of the first people to see this. The courtyard is still probably going to stay the same, but we're real excited about it. And there's just another a picture of it. It's just so cool. They haven't even finished yet. They don't have all the trees going around the Serpentine Avenue. And there's looking down the Bowling Green. The willow mounds are not quite done yet in this picture, but it is just amazing. Here I am putting one of the pots in front of the greenhouse. I dropped it many times before I got it in place. Okay, so just a couple more little things. This is the vineyard enclosure that was researched by the archaeologist about 9 years ago. And this was the first time that the archaeology and the written word married perfectly. They found the ditches Washington mentioned, they found the post holes where they were supposed to be, and they found root stains of the fruit trees. Just absolutely amazing. And so my wife actually also did the research on this and drew the plan for it. Trees, Washington doesn't have a great reputation with trees, but he didn't really chop down a cherry tree. But what you may not know is he was born with a mature head. Yes, he was ahead of his time, but this is one of the trees that he planted in 1785. This is the tulip poplar. It was the Independence tree, declared that in 1976. Washington loved trees. He especially liked trees that bloomed. Trees that bloomed he called clever. And even as a 16-year-old, when he was riding through part of the Ohio Valley, he wrote in his journal that we just rode through a grove of sugar trees, and for the best part of the day, we admired the beauty of the trees and the richness of the land. And this is a 16-year-old who just admired the beauty and the richness of this country so much. You can see why he put his life on the line to fight for it. Another beautiful tree is this pecan tree next to the house, but it doesn't date back to Washington's time. Actually, it only dates to 1860, 1870. It's just really happy and really healthy, and it's grown really fast. It's just a very quick story. Not too many of you are sleeping yet. After Hurricane Isabel, there used to be two of these pecans. There was one right here, so they were kind of sister trees, and it was destroyed to the point that we had to remove it. And the next day after the hurricane, we all standing watching this tree, because during high winds, the tree really does rock and roll, and it is right next to the house. And the director comes up to me and says, "Cut that damn thing down." So I didn't do it immediately, and I had a survey done by a very reputable tree service, and they found that the root flare, the trunk, the branches, the tippy top of the branches, the leaves, everything was as healthy as it could possibly be. Well, I had called my wife after the director said cut it down, and she just could not believe it. She said, well, I can't really say what I usually say because I'm on camera, but she wasn't real happy with that. And so about a month later, I went to the director and I said, well, what do I do? Do I cut it down or not? He says, no, Dean, I trust you. If you think that tree can stand, it's okay. Called my wife. I said, he trusts me. It can stay up. She said, cut that damn thing down. So now we have a Pioneer Farmer site, real exciting. This is when I met Don Bixby, which I just found out tonight. But it's a 4-acre site where we farm like Washington did, and I know we'll come across the images I thought we would find about 25 images ago, but we get our animals down there. Everything's worked in costume and by animal, our milking red Devon oxen, mules, which Washington introduced to the American farmer, our Hog Island sheep, which are another rare breed, and what's that?
Virginia's only breed.
Virginia's only breed. Thank you very much. And we now have the grist mill, which is operational. It was a fully automated mill in George Washington's time. You would put the corn or the wheat on one side. It would come out the other in the bag. And it received U.S. patent number 3. It's called the Oliver Evans system, and we run it today on special weekends. That's the inside, the wheel, which was an enclosed wheel. It's not an overshot wheel, but it fills the buckets, and then the weight would go down. And the reason he had to do this was his water source was not very good. And there are the gears. It's just a fantastic mill. And now, which we're really excited about, is the distillery. Yes, and so free samples all around. But he had 5 stills, and in 1798 generated 11,000 gallons of hooch. And if you came and got the aged stuff, it was 6 hours old. And and you had to bring your own container. He didn't supply that. Someone wrote and said, I'd like to buy some. He said, you better come quick. So, and that's the inside. It was the largest distillery in the country at the time. So, it's the rainbow. Yeah, you can't really see it too well. But If you come to Mount Vernon, whether it's for the beautiful views or for the historic house and rest of the estate, know that you can feel at peace, whether you come or not, that the estate is being watched by some great people. We're very dedicated to representing it accurately, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you tonight. Thank you.